Hello again, and welcome to the first teaching forum for the Carleton community on the Russian war in Ukraine, organized by the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. My name is Crina Viju-Miljusevic, and I'm the director of the Institute, and I'm going to moderate today's roundtable. The second event from this series will take place next week at the same time during the same day, so Thursday, March 24th from 6 p.m. So you are welcome to register for that event, where we'll have with us 4 other experts that will share their knowledge on the topic. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Carleton University is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And in doing so, I acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. It is day 22 since Russia invaded Ukraine. Many lives have been lost among military and civilians. About 3 million people fled Ukraine, and about 1.9 million were internally displaced. Cities and infrastructure were destroyed, and these are just a few of the many impacts of the current war. There are so many questions that we cannot answer, and probably we might not be able to in the near future. However, today we have with us 4 experts that will share their knowledge and understanding of the current situation in Ukraine. So before I introduce them, I'm just going to briefly explain the format of the session. Each panelist will have about 3 minutes to provide some introductory remarks based on a set of questions that I'm going to raise. After that, we will open the Q&A session. Please submit your question at any time in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to pose most of them to our speakers. So I will introduce our speakers in the order of speaking. So I'll start with Markian Dobczansky, who is an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and an administrative associate at the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US. As the historian of the Soviet Union, Russian-Ukrainian relations and urbanization, he is completing a book manuscript titled Between Moscow and Kiev, The Politics of Culture and Soviet Kharkiv. The book traces the development of local identity in Kharkiv, the largest metropolis of the Ukrainian-Russian cultural borderland from 1917 to 1990s. He received a PhD in history from Stanford University and has held fellowships at the George Washington University, the University of Toronto, and Columbia University. You can also follow his tweets about the war via the handle of Dobczansky. Markian will be followed by Paul Goode, who joined EURUS last year as the Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies and Associate Professor. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies and Associate Editor of Nationalities Papers. His research focuses on nationalism and authoritarianism in Russia and the post-Soviet space. Paul will be followed by Joan DeBardeleben, who is a Chancellor Professor in the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and is co-director of Carleton Center for European Studies. Her current research focuses on the EU-Eastern Partnership Policy and EU-Russian relations, including the impact of the 2014 Ukraine crisis on the EU's Russia's policy. She also conducts research on Russian regional elections. And finally, we have Lyubov Zhyznomirska, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at St. Mary University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is interested in issues of migration, regional migration governance, citizenship, and democratization. She also studies the European Union relation with its eastern neighboring countries, primarily with Russia and Ukraine. Having said that, we can get started, and I will start with Markian and the question that I would like him to address in his opening remarks related to his evaluation and assessment of the Ukrainian reaction to the latest stage of the war. Markian.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here with you all, and I'd like to thank the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies for the invitation, and to Jeff Sadea for reaching out. I think one of the most striking ironies of how this war has broken out and how it's been received in international circles is that Russia and the West were both surprised that Ukrainians resisted. Not only that President Zelensky stayed in Kyiv and directed a wide-ranging defense, but that ordinary Ukrainians across central, eastern, and southern Ukraine have gone out of their way to make the invading armies feel unwelcome, often stealing tanks, often just dressing them down in Russian, and joining territorial defense brigades, which are resisting Russian soldiers. And that's all across eastern and southern Ukraine. And I think that should force us to reckon with some of the ways that we understand Ukraine, both in the West and in Russia. And I'll talk a little bit about how Russia understands Ukraine, but I think we should all think about how we in the West see Ukraine and how we look at it. Because what I think is missing from many understandings of Ukrainian, Soviet, Russian history is that Ukrainians have agency. They're demonstrating their historical agency in multiple ways in the current conflict, of course, resisting, showing a commitment, a political commitment to their state, and also claiming the right to exist. And I think that's something that we ought to pay attention to. The best way to do that is to listen to Ukrainian voices and to hear what they have to say. So why are Ukrainians resisting to the extent that they are? Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion about Ukrainian regionalism, how the West is pro-Ukrainian or pro-European, the East is pro-Russian or anti-Western. But Ukrainians seem to be united in resisting Russia's invasion. And why? Because contrary and in contrast to a lot of the way that the coverage is going, this war is not new. This war is an escalation of a war that's been going on for 8 years, since 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea and fomented a separatist conflict in the Donbass. After 8 years of war, Ukrainians have seen 15,000 people in their country killed before tanks rolled across the borders. And Ukrainians have had 8 years, have a long history actually of acting in self-organized ways. So Ukrainians have had 2 revolutions since the year 2000, in which they have largely self-organized and pursued political objectives. And they've also, since the most recent 2014 war, there's been just an explosion of civil society activism, of volunteerism, of assistance to people who are in need. And before the war even broke out, there were 1.5 million internally displaced people within Ukraine, people who had fled the Crimea, people who had fled the Donbass. And so Ukrainians were quite mentally, at least, prepared for this. And then finally, the last point I want to make is that there are some long-term reasons to why we shouldn't be surprised. If we look at Ukrainian history, we can see multiple attempts to declare a Ukrainian state, to pursue an independent state, and also to pursue an independent foreign policy. That's especially true since 1991. But I think all that we have to do is look back to 1917, during what's usually called the Russian Revolution, and to look at the way that the Russian Empire collapsed in the crucible of World War I. We see that not only was there a democratic revolution in Petrograd, followed by a Bolshevik coup in 1917, but there were also widespread independence, or at least political movements in the non-Russian parts of the Russian Empire. And Ukraine played a central role in this. The Ukrainians organized a Central Rada and declared a Ukrainian People's Republic. And this state didn't survive, but the Bolsheviks were very impressed by Ukrainians' efforts to create a state and by the willingness of thousands of Ukrainians to fight for it. And they didn't just go in and destroy the state. They actually created a lookalike state in its place, which became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And when the Soviet Union was created in 1922, it took on a federal structure with Ukraine as one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. So I think we should temper our surprise by studying Ukrainian history and understanding that Ukrainians have historical agency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Markian. So we'll move on to Paul. And Paul, I'm going to ask you, what does Putin want to achieve through this war, and how is the Russian society reacting to this war?
Thanks. So I think in the interest of time, I was going to show some slides. I might sort of save those for later, perhaps, so that we can make sure that everybody has time and we can get to everybody's questions. And very brief, what Putin's proclaimed goals for the war were phrased in terms of demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And these were justified in terms of stopping genocide in Eastern Ukraine, as well as rolling back what's perceived as, fascism and Ukrainian government. Now, I would say that, first of all, neither of these claims are convincing for a variety of reasons that have everything to do with facts rather than perceptions. There is no genocide going on in Eastern Ukraine. There is no fascist regime in Kyiv, even as these are being flogged mightily by the pro-government media, both within Russia and also without. So if those are not convincing explanations, and I can certainly talk about those maybe later in Q&A, then what is really going on? What do these goals mean? I would say, first of all, with regards to denazification, what this means is essentially restoring Russian control over Ukrainian domestic politics. And in practice, what that probably means would be a leadership purge, very likely at the minimum. Now that the war has widened significantly from what Russia expected, the boundaries around what counts as denazification might be difficult to decide, and that might be something that is an unanticipated consequence, but it could certainly widen because if there's not a lot of actual Nazis to be found, there could still be ways that they could be produced. The second goal of demilitarization effectively means preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. This has been a long-standing grievance of Russia's foreign policy, not just NATO expansion, but also the prospect of former Soviet states entering NATO. And this emerges largely as part of what I might call the neo-imperial impulse that drives Russian foreign policy and that also resonates fairly broadly in Russian domestic politics. In a sense, this is Putin's legacy project, right? It's his attempt to unwind the post-Cold War order, which he views as a historical injustice. And that also makes then the current war a piece of unfinished business from the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which Ukraine's declaration of independence was certainly one of the most crucial moments in the Soviet Union's collapse. And I'll just conclude by saying that, again, this is clearly not the war that Putin expected. He expected this to be a quick operation. Obviously, the words war and invasion are banned in Russia even to describe it. But the fact that this is now a much wider war, a grinding conflict, has made this into an existential crisis for Putin's regime. And I think that fact is reflected in the very scary rhetoric that we saw, for instance, in Putin's speech yesterday, when he made reference to fifth columns and to people who are traitors to Russia in their minds. It has opened up the possibility that there could be purges in Russia as the sentiment in support of a quick and easy operation starts to fade as people become aware of the actual extent of losses, as people become aware of the extent to which propaganda does not meet up with falling living standards. And I think that that is something that does genuinely concern the regime, and it should also concern everybody else, because it's unpredictable exactly what would follow. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We'll move on to John. John, can you give us your thoughts about the Western reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the possible thinking behind these responses?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much, Crina. In the interest of being a little bit quicker, I'm going to actually show some slides, and because you'll be able to maybe see the points a little bit more clearly that way. And so first, the Western reaction has been a very unified, quick, and comprehensive one, primarily because the West has seen the Russian invasion as an assault on the whole system of international law. And if successful, if the Russian venture is successful, undermining the world order as we know it, and possibly encouraging other dictators or authoritarian leaders to follow in Putin's mold. So I put here a list of just many of the kinds of tools the West has used to respond. And I can't talk about all of them, but you can see they're very wide ranging. US, UK, EU, other countries coordinated in this effort. And they include the sanctions that you've probably heard so much about, which have a broad span, financial, attacking oligarchs, elites and their families, freezing assets, other things like that. Removing most favored nation trade status from Russia, closing the airspace to Russian aircraft. Whoops, I lost my slide. And then in addition to that, various forms of economic aid, military equipment and expertise, humanitarian aid. Russia's been expelled from the Council of Europe, charged with war crimes before the International Criminal Court. Also, you've seen all the private firms withdrawing. That's been quite a story. Exclusion from sports and cultural events and combating misinformation. This is a set of responses that I think is truly unprecedented and actually a bit surprising, maybe even that it occurred so quickly and in such a unified manner. Now, you might ask, we have all these sanctions and measures in effect, but Russia's behavior hasn't changed. And that's a little bit concerning. So what is the idea as to how these sanctions might work, which is what I really want to address briefly next. And I have kind of three major points here. The first is to impose very high costs on Russia of the invasion. And these are economic, they're reputational, and they are also, of course, by the actions of Ukrainians themselves, military. And why would imposing high costs make a difference? Well, I can think of two, important ways. And one would be to strengthen the Ukrainian negotiating position if there's going to be a negotiated settlement. The more Russia has lost, the more Russia is going to want to have a settlement. And that puts the Ukrainians in a much stronger position when they're at the negotiating table as they are now. Now, we don't know if those negotiations will be successful, but I think that's one possible effect of these measures. Second is to deter future action. I mean, of course, we're not so worried about that right now. We want to get this war over with and have, Ukraine come out intact. But there's certainly a possibility that if Russia were successful, it could take moves against other countries, including other non-NATO countries like Moldova and Georgia. Or if the cost is not high, Russia might be emboldened to even engage in a conflict with NATO. Of course, also another objective is to block resources from going to the Russian military so that there won't the capacity of the Russian military to retool itself will be impeded. And then possibly influencing the configuration of power within Russia to hopefully, mobilize somebody to stop this internally. Now, I think that might not be so likely, but part of the measures against the oligarchs and the elites may be directed at that kind of an objective. The public has little ability to influence the outcome, but nonetheless, it could help to raise the costs and therefore reinforce this first point if the public becomes discontented. So I just put a map here to show these other countries that are not NATO members, Georgia and Moldova, and of course the blue ones here are the NATO countries which are very close to Ukraine, which NATO is committing itself to defending in a military way should Russia begin to expand its actions. Now there are some really important issues that are being debated right now, and you've probably seen them in the media. Should there be a no-fly zone imposed by the West over Ukraine? This is something Ukraine has requested. It hasn't been agreed to, and the main reason is that it would probably bring NATO into direct conflict with Russia and could expand the war to be a NATO-Russia war or to even be a world war. So NATO has resisted that, but there are arguments out there, not only from Ukrainians, but from other people in the West, even from military people who are arguing for this as a way to kind of tip the balance in Ukraine's favor. And another big issue is limits on imports of energy, which would be a very big move for Europe because Europe is heavily dependent on Russian energy. But we're seeing, medium term, that's definitely, I think, going to happen. But in the short term, could Europe manage that? There's also some other questions here, some problematic issues. Will these measures actually increase support for Putin? Will the Russian citizens blame the West? What are the risks of isolating Russia, especially in the medium to long term? Will Russia just turn to China? And will Russia react with more brutal methods when placed under pressure? So it's a very difficult balance. And it seems that the West has gone kind of full force with every non-military tool available and ramping them up over time. So I'll stop there and turn it over to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you so much, John. So moving forward to Lyubov. Lyubov, I'm wondering if you can briefly chat about the EU's policies regarding the Ukrainian refugees fleeing the country as compared to Canada's, and especially how the European countries at the borders are affected by the large number of refugees.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna quickly share, just for the sake of also saving time and illustrating. Can you see my PowerPoint? No. Can you? PowerPoint? The map?
No, it's the official website.
Okay,
of the European...
I have to stop. Okay, then I've never done this on my work computer. I used to be at home. So for the sake of saving time, so I wanted to start by saying a few theses as a migration scholar. So we have heard this week that every minute 55 Ukrainian children become refugees, and in the UNICEF report, they said that the Ukrainian child has become a refugee almost every single second since the start of the war. And 75,000 children become refugees every day. The war, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has produced more than 3 million displaced people, and it has been the fastest growing refugee crisis since the World War II. It's important to understand that when we see the numbers of people crossing the border, and we hear more than 1.5 million people crossed into Poland alone, when they cross the borders in search of safety, there are also people who are staying within Ukraine. There are millions of people who are staying within Ukraine, and those who are staying in the northern, eastern, and southern regions of Ukraine, either under siege or in occupation, or simply hoping not to have to flee their homes. The situation, depending on how the war proceeds, might produce a next wave of displacement and further refugee flows. And those flows might be more vulnerable than the first flows that we witnessed. It is also important to understand that displacement by war in Ukraine is unique in a way, because Ukraine borders has a visa-free regime with the European Union's countries that are part of the Schengen. So that means Ukrainian citizens who were able to have, who had resources in the initial days, and there have been stages in how people were arriving from even Kyiv, around Kyiv regions, depending on the movement of Russian troops. Those people, sorry, I lost my, they were able to cross the borders, and they were also, foreigners were also displaced by the violence. Ukrainians didn't need to have visas. They showed up in thousands at their western borders of their country and were able to enter. It was not the same case for foreigners. And if you remember, foreigners who were in Ukraine before the war started, some Western governments appealed for people to leave, for their nationals to leave. And so international students, thousands of international students or foreigners who reside in Ukraine, and whose passports do not have visa and countries do not have visa-free regime with Ukraine, found themselves in a different situation. As of 2 days ago, and it's important to mention as of 2 days ago, because the situation changes every day and the number grows, around 136,000 foreigners were crossed the border of Ukraine in search of safety as well. In the first wave of displacement, we have people staying closer to home. So that's why we have so much concentration of Ukrainians in Poland, Slovakia, Moldova, Hungary. We know about 200,000 Ukrainians who arrived in Czech Republic, and this week Czech Republic already mentioned that they reached their capacity to house Ukrainians seeking safety. European Union responded by triggering temporary protection mechanism. So when we talk about protection that Ukrainians are given in European countries, and the same comment applies to Canada, it is a temporary protection, right? It's not a full Geneva Convention refugee status that these individuals are granted. Currently, as the situation stands, Ukrainians are able to safely reside, Ukrainians and those foreigners who can prove that they were legal residents of Ukraine at the time of invasion. They can stay for 1 year with access to housing, with access to social support, schooling, for example, for Ukrainian children. They are able to have access to those temporary protection, and it is supposed to expire on March 4th next year with a possibility of extension for 6 more months. So that's a temporariness of that protection. Some of the relaxation of the rules that has happened has to do with whether people have to necessarily have documents, because some of them left their homes just with the clothes as they had on and did not necessarily have possibility to collect, have this luggage ready, because no one expected that people would have to flee in a way, right? Or that the war will start. So there is release of some of the conditions for the documents availability, but they still need to register with local authorities where they arrive and then trigger the mechanism of applying for protection. It's important to emphasize that people usually stay closer to their home. So the secondary movement within the European Union, we do not yet have full picture and how many arrive further away, like in Germany, France, or other countries, the UK, Ireland. There is a lot of pressure to lift visa restrictions, such as the UK, and allow Ukrainians to at least join their family members, right? So the situation is evolving in that regard. In case of Europe, Canada, for example, so Canada does not have a temporary protection mechanism as such. We use more of a full status refugee and resettlement as our major element in the refugee policy. So Canada started with expediting the process of arrival of Ukrainians who have been already in the process of visa residency application, and also responded, Canada allowed unlimited application for visas for Ukrainians. What it means, if they're escaping war, they can apply for visa following all the requirements in terms of biometrics and security of documents, and apply for visa. And then when they arrive, they are able to find work. So initially it was announced 2 years, but now today Canadian government actually announced that it's going to be a 3-year permit. So Ukrainians can stay for 3 years in Canada. They do not have refugee status. That's important to understand. They have special conditions of reuniting with their family members as well. That applies to children and parents, but not to grandparents or not to siblings with children, right? So nothing has changed in that regard. Today, Trudeau was also quoted saying that there is a possibility, if there is a need for evacuation flights, that they might consider that. So the opening, in a way, what is unprecedented is that there is no quota on how many Ukrainians will be accepted on this visa or ability to come. So there's a removal of the limitation. And I'll be able, I'll be happy to answer questions in the
Okay. Thank you so much, Lyubov. So we have now about half an hour of questions. I already received a few on the Q&A and a few on the chat. I will certainly encourage you to use the Q&A. It's hard to focus on both channels. I will start by asking, well, I think, Paul, you did mention about the Nazification of Ukraine. I think the question that was raised was, in fact, whether the Putin's political regime can be characterized as fascist, and if not, why? And I'll pose another question for the beginning. What will happen to the Russian Federation in the future? Can you envision a collapse? And also, I would connect it to another one. How is the international reputation of Russia affected by this war, and how do you see this? I mean, maybe it's too early to say anything about these issues, but what is your opinion about how the future will look like for Russia, let's say? So whoever, I mean, we can start with Paul, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I could start with the last question first because that's the easiest. I would say adversely. Russia's reputation will be difficult to rehabilitate. In particular, I think the way that it has pursued effectively negotiations in bad faith for a number of months now means that any security guarantees that it offers are not going to be worth the paper that it's written on. That goes not just for the current conflict, but I think also what happens after the conflict. It will be very difficult for anybody to be willing to sit down and take seriously anything that Russia has to offer. And especially rebuilding those ties is going to be a long-term process. So I don't see that, restoring the state of relations anywhere where they were, and then even in the 1990s, perhaps for the foreseeable future. And a lot, of course, will hinge on how this war ends. With regards to the nature of the regime, I could take an academic moment here to say, first of all, that fascism is one of these terms that is often used in political weaponry, but is very difficult. Actually, there's a lot of debate over how to pin down exactly its meaning when it's abstracted from a specific historical political context. And so one of the things that we see in particular is that Russia has defined a lot of its own identity around the concept of anti-fascism. Even the youth groups that it sponsors sort of characterize themselves as anti-fascism. This is sort of a common slogan, and partly this is wrapped up in the ways that Putin has sought to craft the state's legitimacy around the memory of the Second World War and Russia's place in that war. So it can't not even imagine itself as fascist, but rather everything that it does is essentially oriented towards fighting fascism. And that extends, of course, to the present day. That doesn't not make Russia fascist, of course. And so if we think about the different attributes that are associated with fascism, the presence of paramilitarism, anti-statism, nationalist ideology, these things are certainly present, and they have increased dramatically since the launch of the invasion on February 24th. There are other things that are not present. We don't see mass mobilization of society. Instead, the regime prefers to keep the society demobilized for the most part, right? Russia is not a single party state, nor does the party actually wield power really independently of Putin. But we do see sort of definitely rising nationalism in a public sense. One of the big things that is missing is a clear ideology. And in many ways, what really drives Russia is sort of a mix of neo-imperialist impulses that I mentioned before, and kleptocratic interests, right? This is a state which is oriented around stealing, and is basest element, and everybody within Russia will tell you as much, regardless of whether they support the regime. This is not even an open secret. And in that sense, there's just not a lot in the sense of ideas that bind people to the regime and that would lead them to sacrifice for it or mobilize them without coercion or without interest. There is an attempt now to give that appearance in the form of astroturfing, and trying to sort of to conjure up the image that there is a groundswell of popular support for the regime. And this takes the form in particular of disciplining physical bodies, or getting people to form flash mobs where they form the letter Z, the Z, which has become sort of a symbol for Russia's war, which Russia can't call a war. And that this symbol of the Z has been likened to a modern day version of the swastika, but shorn of pagan imagery and roots, as well as of the ideological connections with it. So I would say there is some fascist aesthetic to Putin's regime, but it lacks some of the historical elements that have previously characterized fascist regimes. What ultimately is the upshot of that, though, is that I think that you don't have the same kinds of popular dynamics in terms of state-society relations that one would expect to see in state-society relations or in fascist regimes. And I think that tells us something about the stakes of the label. And then just quickly with regards to whether or not Russia would collapse, I mean, that would be the worst possible scenario, I think. And I think probably what is more likely, if the current dynamics continue to unfold, as we get something that looks more like, a rump Serbia, following the wars in the former Yugoslav states, right? That Russia retreats within its borders, perhaps, and it becomes a kleptocracy within its own borders. But that, Putin is besieged and ensconced. There are no heroes in Russian politics, right? There's nobody left to challenge him. And that's part of the reason why he felt perhaps emboldened to launch this war in the first place. So I don't think that leads to the disintegration of Russia necessarily, but certainly a lot with what happens in terms of the impact of sanctions may have something to do with that. Past sanctions have not had the effect of weakening support on the regime. Instead, it has intensified the willingness to blame the West. And that would certainly be likely to continue probably under the current circumstances.
Thank you so much, Paul. Anyone would be interested to take these questions, or I can ask other questions? We have plenty. So maybe we can move some other question. I think one that comes a couple of times is the fact that now it's becoming more clear that Zelensky was, through Zelensky's remarks, that Ukraine was never to be accepted in NATO. And do you think that that was the reality or not? And why was that? And I would ask another question, Lyubov, for you directly. Do you know if Russian nationals married to Ukrainian nationals might benefit from being allowed in Canada during this time of war? And one specifically for John, when it comes to the no-fly zone, do you believe that Zelensky recognizes that such a response is unlikely and that he's simply over-requesting in order to receive more aid from the West as compensation? So I'll stop here. There are other interesting questions, but maybe we'll have another round of questions.
I could address the NATO one if you to start off.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I think it was relatively unrealistic that Ukraine would be admitted to NATO in any near future. I mean, even the idea of a membership action plan probably wouldn't have occurred in the earliest until 2023. But I think given the destabilization in the country, that Zelensky's understanding that it's unlikely that Ukraine would be admitted to NATO is correct. And however, the problem with giving that concession, and Zelensky made clear when he sort of hinted at a possible concession there, is that Ukraine would want a security guarantee, and a guarantee that whatever concessions were made, that Ukraine's territorial integrity would then be protected. And that becomes very problematic because such a security guarantee actually was given in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in something called the Budapest Memorandum. And this was something that Russia actually signed, and it provided a guarantee of Ukraine's territorial integrity by taking that action. And obviously it was violated. It was violated already in 2014. Now it's been violated again in a very gross and egregious and unbelievably horrible manner in 2022. So who could give that security guarantee? Well, that was what NATO was supposed to do, and that's why Ukraine wanted to join NATO. So if Ukraine gives up the idea of joining NATO, even though I agree it's probably not a very likely scenario anyway, that leaves the question of where can the security guarantee come from? And if it's just a promise on paper from Russia and from some Western countries, who's going to enforce that? And that's a really big question. So I think that's really the big conundrum behind this potential kind of kind of solution to the problem. It's not to say there's nothing to be discussed there. It definitely should be discussed. And that's, it's movement toward a direction of a possible solution. But it's not very clear how the detail of that would be worked out and who would play the role of being that guarantor of security for Ukraine, which is obviously very important. There's huge distrust here. How can this distrust ever be overcome on the part of Ukrainians? It's hard to imagine. And even on the part of Western countries toward Russia, how could that distrust be overcome? So we don't have, an international police force, and the UN can't do anything because Russia has a veto power there. So this is the conundrum that we're in with that. Is Zelensky trying to bargain for more with the request for a no-fly zone? I don't know, perhaps, but there are people who, there is an argument out there, and I don't know if he believes it or if others, how much of it is belief and how much of it is an argument to be made, is that eventually the conflict's probably going to involve NATO anyway. I mean, this is kind of an argument out there that, the way it's going, it doesn't look like the war is going to end soon. Probably NATO's going to have to get involved sooner or later anyway, so better sooner rather than later. And that will increase NATO's credibility to actually just bite the bullet now and actually take an action, even though it might impose a risk. Some people say that Russia's bluff would be called, but of course we don't know that. And because Putin seems to be acting, in my view anyway, somewhat irrationally, I don't see the rationality of the action that he's taking in Ukraine. I can't see how it's going to benefit Russia in the final analysis anyway. So if Putin is acting irrationally now, you can't really count on rationality later. And so if pushed, he might actually do something quite destructive. So, but, there are those arguments there that not only does someone like Zelensky make and many supporters of that position in Ukraine, but also, as I mentioned, you can listen to the debates on the Western TV and you'll see various experts coming up and saying first that Putin's bluff could be, should be called, and that the risk is not as high. Now, I don't myself subscribe to that position. I think it's a considerable risk because Putin is very unpredictable at the moment.
So if I may, just to add to what Joan was saying, we have to remember that NATO membership is part of Ukraine's constitution now, the path towards North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the workability of that promise or that negotiations, of the scenario of being able to actually go through the constitutional reform when you have a martial law in place and when you have a war, is unlikely, right? And then the mobilization of the society that we are witnessing now at the moment of the struggle is 2022, but the history of fighting for independence and sovereignty is centuries long. So I think that's also that aspect that giving up on NATO membership is not such an easy solution when you have more than 50% of the population supporting the idea. And Joan hit it right well, that it's not who will provide security guarantees. So if we were to look at the wider international relations, if all the pieces are moving, including the United Nations and some of the regional bloc security guarantees are in movement. Whether any workable solution can be arrived, we don't know, but I think it's too early to say because of the unpredictability of what Russians will do. And before I answer my question about immigration and Russian nationals, I think I do want to also emphasize the cult of Putin that is dismissed in some of the cultivation of the imagery, of that macho imagery that his regime has been built on, and how much Russians are buying into it or not. And so that's what the fascist regimes were characterized by the cult of a leader. Whether the system will crack and the support will crack, we will see, but some of the, we will see with time. But what is important to understand that there is no easy separation at this point between citizens who were supporting Putin's actions and who are rallying behind him in an understanding of solving Ukraine's question. Because I know that there is a performativity in the regime portrayal of its solid image inside the country. So first of all, Putin is working now towards consolidating that population base, and I personally am not willing to say that it's gonna crack easily that nature of support that Putin has had among its population. As to my question that I had about if Russian nationals married to Ukrainian nationals might benefit from being allowed into Canada during this time. I don't think it matters, the citizenship matters if one resided within Ukraine on legal grounds, right? And if they are escaping Ukraine's territory where there is war. So that would be an important part where they are fleeing from. If they are escaping Russia as a regime that they don't trust, then the mechanism would be a procedure which is administratively burdensome procedure of applying for refugee status. But that would be like a different answer. So in this case, I don't have enough information to say where this couple is fleeing from, but it's important. So if someone had still a Russian passport but resided in Ukraine, they should have the same rules as would it apply to Ukrainians. But it's speculative in a way. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have just 10 minutes left and a large number of questions, very good questions. I'm going to pick a few for a last round of answers. I'm sorry for the ones that I cannot pose. Hopefully we'll get them next week in our session. One that I would ask is, do you think is feasible that we would enter an era where Russia will be cut off from European energy markets and rely on Asia for trade of energy and commodities? How realistic that is? One of them. UN and UN Security Council, given the Russian veto, what is the possibility there to intervene through the UN? Third, what's the role of Belarus? And what is Lukashenko looking for out of this situation? And I would end with the fourth, role of China here. How do you think China will react and will behave during the war, and whether it will be a place for Russia to turn to soon? So anyone who wants, maybe Markian, you haven't had the chance to take any Q&A, so we can start with you and we move on to the others after. Yeah.
I guess I'd like to take the Belarus question, because what we've seen in Belarus is that, within the last 2 years, there were some of the largest anti-regime protests in the history of Belarus, with like millions of people mobilized against him, against Lukashenko. And what Belarus has done, Belarus has been a dictatorship for several decades now, but what it has historically done since the 90s is to try to play the West and Russia off against one another. So Lukashenko has balanced, or at least attempted to balance. And now, because of the brutal way that the Lukashenko regime repressed its protest movements, it's made the Western option completely unviable. And so Lukashenko is more dependent on Putin personally and on Russia for support than he's ever been. And I think that leaves Belarus in the position of being at the whim of what Lukashenko wants to do. This is why Lukashenko has allowed his territory to be used as a staging ground for Russian armed forces invading Ukraine, for rocket launches and shelling from Belarus. But you also see within Belarus some signs that all is not well within the command structure of the Belarusian military. And so I guess I don't know that Belarus is, as a country, is very committed to this at all. But of course, the leadership is very much so, because it's dependent on Putin for support.
I'd be happy to address the energy question if.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think already Europe has clearly signaled that it's moving away from Russia as an energy provider. I I think 2/3 reduction by the end of the year. And whether this, can happen, I think it will definitely move in that direction, and it may facilitate a move to a greener economy more quickly. I'm not sure about a total cutoff. I think it might be more along the lines of diversifying the sources of energy, as long as Russia continues to be willing to provide some energy to Europe, so as not to make Europe so dependent on Russian energy. The move toward a Chinese option has already begun to occur, as we know that already after the Crimean annexation, there already was the development of new pipelines going to China. And I would see the economic relationship between China and Russia intensifying, but just very briefly, that may not work to Russia's favor. I mean, that may be jumping from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak, because China is a very much more powerful country economically than Russia is. And I think China could be a big winner in this conflict potentially, and that might be why it's trying to hedge its bets and not line up with the Western approach, and also not totally line up with the Russian approach by abstaining. But I'm not sure that that's going to really benefit Russia in the long run. I don't think either the oligarchs or the educated population or the middle class or the upper middle class really wants to spend all their vacation time in Shanghai and in Beijing, and to forego the benefits of Western culture and pleasures and freedom of life. So that could create some pushback, I think, from the population. And I think as far as the sanctions go after the end of the war, it really depends how the war ends. I mean, if the war ends well for Ukraine, I think there could be, or if Russia makes concessions, there could be some sanctions lifted. If the war ends very badly for Ukraine, then I think the sanctions will stay in place for quite a long time. Many of them will, in any case. Look at what happened after 2014, a much less egregious breach of international law than the one we're seeing now. And those sanctions stayed in place for 8 years until the day that the Ukraine war started, the war in Ukraine started. So I think that Russia can't reckon with those sanctions being lifted very soon, unless they concede a whole lot more than we really think they're very likely to do. Very quickly, sorry, but that's...
Yes, Paul, please.
I'd just maybe add a comment or two about China, and then also address the UN question. First of all, I agree with everything that Joan said regarding Russia's relationship with China. There was, of course, an attempt to pivot towards China that never really sort of caught on economically or otherwise. It's also pretty clear that Russia cannot replace the energy trade with Europe with trade with China, at least not any time in the near future. I think it's also worth pointing out that China is furious with Russia right now because of its invasion of Ukraine. Taiwan now realizes that it cannot count on anybody to come to its rescue. And so Taiwan is now mobilizing in a way that was not previously expected. China now has a united West in a way that wasn't the case before the invasion of Ukraine. It's now sort of at risk of catching splash damage from sanctions. And so that's been part of its tepid response and supporting Russia as well. And so there's all sorts of things that have complicated the relationship between China and Russia. And add to this, of course, the fact that China is now keenly aware not only that Russia is increasingly dependent upon China for trade and also for access to international reserves in light of sanctions. There's also the fact that China is directly competing with Russia for influence in Central Asia. And now knowing that Russia is tied up with conflict in Ukraine and is not going to have the resources to be able to do a lot in Central Asia, that opens up a lot of opportunities for China that previously weren't there. And so I think that China in some ways is furious with Russia. In other ways, it's punching the air right now because it can pursue a geopolitical agenda that it wasn't able to do so before. And that's not going to work to Russia's advantage. The other thing with regards to the UN, I think that's worth mentioning, is that the United Nations is the one organization where Russia feels it actually receives recognition for its status, because it received that recognition as successor state to the Soviet Union and has the permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It's also the one thing that allows Russia to be able to claim that it speaks on behalf of the global South, despite the General Assembly vote to the contrary, suggesting that actually the world is pretty much united against Russia as far as its invasion of Ukraine goes. And so if Russia was expelled from the UN, that would be disastrous for the claims that it represents the forces of the world that are opposed to the West, if actually the forces of the General Assembly of the UN united to remove Russia from that role. Now, I don't know if that's actually possible. I'm not an expert on international organizations, but it has been critical for the way that Russia has justified its claims to international status. And so it would be symbolically a powerful defeat for Russia if that were ultimately to come to pass.
Could I quickly add? Oh.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Thank you, Markian. Just wanted to quickly add the question asks what the UN can do anything to intervene. So in a way, the United States said that they will not support removing Russia from the Security Council or from the United Nations. So the United Nations, to a large extent, is paralyzed with overseeing the war between two states, because in the former Yugoslavia, there was a concept of, kind of the country falling apart into separate countries, and there was a peacemaking role for to step in. So in this case, neither of the countries would request assistance, right? Because there is a reputational aspect to that, and there is a specific role that peacekeepers or anyone can play. There is no army that the United Nations can employ or can ask. There is no mechanism of closing the sky through the United Nations mechanisms as well, because no one is really in a position to deploy air carriers, fighter jets through the United Nations mechanism, right? So there's symbolical importance of seeking alliances for Ukraine and using General Assembly, using International Criminal Court of Justice to show false narrative that the Russians are using. But in practical terms, because of the sovereignty mechanism, that is recognition of equality of sovereignty and Russia presence on the Security Council, it's not really an option unless the whole world is creative. And again, it's speculation. I'm not going to go there.
Thank you, Markian. You wanted to add something?
Just one more point. I mean, this really is going to be a thing that a catastrophe for Russia in terms of its soft power, and that's not going to go away for quite a long time. Just two examples. The Uzbek foreign minister has just made a statement today, I believe, that says that they recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that they do not recognize the DNR and LNR's independence, that is the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And also Kazakhstan, although the government has been quite cautious about speaking out on this issue, there's been just an enormous surge of humanitarian assistance that Kazakhstani society is organizing to send to Ukraine. So I know from living in Kazakhstan that Kazakhstanis pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine. They don't always agree, but they know that they have their own issues in the north of Kazakhstan, where there is an ethnically Russian minority that lives there. So, I mean, I think that Russia's neighbors can draw the conclusions from the brutal way that Russia is prosecuting this war, and it's not going to redound to Russia's benefit.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. It was great to hear your thoughts and to share your expertise with us. We hope you will join us with other occasions, maybe with happier occasions sometime soon. Thank you for everyone that has joined the InTeach session. As a reminder, you can register for our second session for next week. The poster will be available starting on Monday on the Institute website. With that said, have a good night and enjoy the nice weather. Bye.